it. So I was thinking what to do today. And I've decided to focus on what is, if you want, the most thorny, the most pressing question in Tolkien studies. In a way, everyone who has worked on Tolkien somehow has to address this question. And I deal with this question in chapter 4 of the book, and I will kind of give you a glimpse in a way of the arguments that I do that. But in a sense, I will try not to go too deep to a certain extent, but to start paving the way to indeed, or to, if not to solve, at least to consider this question, which is, of course, very central, as I said. And the question is really the question on Tolkien and allegory. We already heard last year, if you remember, Holly Ordway talking about that. And today I will sort of take a bit of a different stance, which is maybe complementary, a bit more literary, because that's where I come from. I'm a literary critic and a philologist, and not even a philosopher. But the two things, as we know, are very much intertwined in Tolkien. So the question I will address, as I say, is this apparent contradiction that I'm sure many of us are already aware of, but just to refresh your memory, we know very well, of course, that Tolkien was strongly advocating against allegory, and more specifically against allegorical interpretation of his book. I just read two very famous passages. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old, aware enough to detect its presence. So that's in the preface of The Lord of the Rings. And the second, dealing directly with the issue of the exegesis of the work. There is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. It is a fairy story. I could go on forever and ever. There are plenty of quotations from the letters in other books, in other texts where he published and unpublished, for the people who explore the Tolkien archive, where he really talks a lot about allegory. But at the same time, of course, in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, there are plenty of elements that are very open to an allegorical interpretation. It is to say, an interpretation that reveals somehow a hidden meaning, typically a moral one or a doctrinal one, and typically associated with this Christian faith or his Christian doctrine. And I could choose many, and I chose one that Tom Shipp himself acknowledged as being allegorical, or almost allegorical. That's the song of the eagle of the Lord of the West, who comes to announce the victory over Sauron, and sings, "Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of God, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken. Your king hath passed through, and he is victorious, and he shall dwell among you all the days of your life, and the tree that was wither shall be renewed." And of course, as Tom Shipp rightly points out, here Revelations seems very close, and allegory does all but break through. The first statement could very easily apply to death and hell, and the second to Christ and the second coming. And of course, many people have interpreted these sort of elements as allegorically, and specifically as Christian allegories. And there are really like hundreds of elements, from the characterization of Frodo, and from the death and return of Gandalf, and we can go on forever. And to make things even more problematic, Tolkien himself allows, in some letters, for an interpretation of the book as an allegory. You can make the ring into an allegory of our own time, if you like, an allegory of the inevitable fate that waits for all attempts to defeat evil power by power. So that's the contradiction. How do we solve it? Is Tolkien lying? Is he deluded himself? He has a sort of schizophrenic personality. He's used different language in different contexts. That's exactly the question that I'm going to address in the next half an hour, essentially. Okay, and I think that by addressing this question, we go to the very depth of Tolkien's own literary philosophy, if you want, or maybe even literary theology, or in any case, we go to the depth of what he believed to be the task and the nature of sub-creation. But let's start, of course, in medias res, as always we will do, or most specifically in ultimas res, at the very end of the story. As you remember, after the ring has been destroyed, on the slopes of Mount Doom, the Hobbit Sam addresses his companion Frodo with these powerful words. "What a tale we have been in, Mr. Frodo, haven't we?" he said. "I wish I could hear it told. Do you think they'll say, 'Now comes the story of the nine-fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom'? And then everyone will hush like we did when in Rivendell they told us that the tale of Bear in one hand and the great jewel. I wish I could hear it, and I wonder how it will go after our own part. The question is, who is this barren one end and the story of the great jewel? And of course, I don't have to explain it to you, because I'm sure most of you or all of you are very familiar with the story. But again, just to refresh a bit our memory, Beren is, quoting Tolkien himself, the outlaw mortal who succeeds, with the help of Lúthien, a mermaid and even Ifadel for royalty, when all the armies and warriors have failed. He penetrates the stronghold of the enemy, arrests one of the Silmarilli, which they are these wonderful gems sub-created by containing the divine light from the Iron Crown. Thus, he wins the hand of Lúthien, and the first marriage of mortal and immortal is achieved. The capture of the Silmaril, a supreme victory, leads to disaster. The oath of the Sons of Fëanor becomes operative, and lust for the Silmaril brings all the kingdoms of the elves to ruin. Just to use Tolkien's own words, because they're quite, in a way, efficient in summing up the story of Beren. It's a story that we know that can be traced back very early in the life of Tolkien, to the years after his return from the First World War and the Battle of the Somme, but it's a story being tinkered with for most of his own life, and in fact it was published in its final form only posthumous in 2017, so almost 100 years after original germ. It's a very important tale. It's the kernel of the mythology, as Tolkien will describe it, but the question is, why is Sam referring to this tale in this very moment? Okay, what's the literary meaning behind that? And to answer to this question, I think we need to recall that in the Lord of the Rings there are many connections, many ancestral connections with the world of the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is a posthumous work. Of course, now we can read it, or at least part of it. But when the Lord of the Rings was published, people did not have access to it, and yet they could feel while reading the Lord of the Rings that there was an ancestral past in the background of the Lord of the Rings. There are also some elements, some characters like some swords, some Galadriel, Sauron, and so on, that act as sort of links connecting the two different worlds. That's the first way, if you want, in which the different stories are integrated. If you think about Beren lived many thousands before the time of the War of the Ring, yet there is somehow a connection there, which is first of all historical, but it is also literary, because characters like Frodo and Sam and the hobbits have been introduced to the story of Beren and Lúthien as pieces of secondary literature. They were, to a certain extent, the story of Beren and Lúthien is a bit like the Homer story or the Virgil story would be for us, or Shakespeare would be a sort of classic story. All the elves will know about this story, and also the hobbits themselves are introduced to this very important tale twice in the Lord of the Rings. If you remember, the first is in the chapter where the Nazgûl attack Aragorn and the hobbits at Weathertop, and just before they do that, the Sam, who's a great lover of elvish stories, ask Aragorn to tell them some other tales of the older tales, and Strider Aragorn say, "Yeah, I will tell you the tale of Tinuviel, for it is a long tale of which the end is not known." So Sam, in a way, refers to the Beren story because he knows it. He has listened to it once in oral form, and then later, during the days of the Council of Elrond, you will hear again in full, and it's underlined in full, the lay of Beren and Lúthien and the winning of the Great Jewel. So you see the same story, which to a certain extent corresponds to the different variants of the story as Tolkien was working in prose and in poetry, are received by the hobbits as pieces of secondary literature. So there is, you can see in that particular passage for which I started, a meta-literary event, because we have the hobbits referring to a tale they have listened to. So first of all, Sam refers to it because he knows it and he has heard it quite a few times during his journey, but there is more than that. He does not simply refer to it, but he associates himself and his own story, the story of him and Frodo, with the story of Beren. It's the same story. And this is, if you want, is the end of a process of awareness, of somehow of a literary meta-awareness, which involves Sam and Frodo to be aware that their story, the story they are living, is part of a bigger tale. It's a short story, but it's part of the bigger story. And this, I will argue that this starts, or at least as an important moment during the Council of Elrond, where Frodo decides to take on the ring and begins his mission. And it is not coincidental that at that point, Elrond will say to him, this is the hour of the Shire folk when they rise from the quiet fields to shake the towers and the council of the great. And I will say that your choice is right. And though all the mighty elf friends of old, Hador and Húrin and Túrin and Beren himself, you see Beren himself, were assembled together, your seat should be among them. So we see here how Frodo, in a way, joins the tale of Beren and Lúthien later, but in general, he joins, if you want, the tales of the ancient world, of the first age of the world. Another very important step in this journey of literary awareness, if you want, is what Tolkien defines as the disquisition on the seamless web of story. That is to say, a dialogue that Frodo and Sam have on the stairs of Cirith Ungol on the way to Mordor, which again is, if you want, another chain in this narrative, another ring in this narrative chain. And I quote, Beren now, and it's Sam speaking, Beren now, he never thought he was going to get the Silmaril from the Iron Crown, sorry, there's a bit missing, and the Silmaril went on and came to Erendil. And why, sir, you've got some of the light of it in the star glass that Levi gave you. I never thought of that before. Why? To think of it, we are in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? So we see here how in the sudden moment of revelation, Sam understands that they are within the same ongoing tale of Beren. It's the same tale which continues to them and which will continue after them after their part is over, as Frodo points out. As also revealed in this passage, this narrative continuity between the story of Beren and the story of Frodo is highlighted by some, again, constants. And in this particular case, the constant is the light of the Silmaril. The Silmaril is the Silmaril that Erendil managed to rescue, is now carrying as the light of the star of the morning and the star of the evening. And a bit of the light is contained in the star glass that Galadriel has given to them. So the connection there, this kind of going connection, is also physical. It's also related to a particular artifact. And we may see how in the two stories of Beren and Frodo, there are in fact many of these elements, many elements that connect, many constants, narrative constants that connect the two tales. We already saw the light of the Silmaril, but also Shelob himself is quite similar, or maybe is even the same kind of monster that Beren fought in the Gorgoroth of the ancient world, which is also the place where Sam and Frodo are going. The blade is not the same, but both Frodo and Sam and Beren fight with some ancestral blades. And also, again, I don't have the time to discuss all these narrative constants. I do it in the book, but there are some even episodes of the story which are quite similar to the story of Beren. Like, for instance, the episode where Beren and companions, and in this case Frodo and Sam, dress up like orcs. And again, there are similarities that get to the level of even intertextual relationship. I have a long table in the book where I really point out how similar the two tales of Beren and Frodo are. I will just focus on one particular narrative cost. Sorry, before we go on, this kind of narrative constant between the two tales is something that Tolkien himself pointed out. So it's not something that I'm making him up myself. Tolkien said, in fact, that Frodo and Sam history is, in a sense, only a further continuation of the story of Beren and Lúthien. Again, that's a bit hidden, but for Tolkien was a very important element of the story of Frodo. There are, as I said, many other elements. We could go on for more than one lecture to talk about connections between the two tales, but we'll focus on one in particular, which, again, clearly Tolkien was very aware of, and as we're going to see, and that's the moment where the three eagles come to rescue, in this case, Frodo and Sam, in the case of Beren's story, Beren and Lúthien from the mountain of Morgoth. These are the two passages. Again, I don't have the time to read all of them, but I will just simply point out that the situation is indeed very similar. we have two couples of very improbable heroes, one of whom is maimed, that's important. Beren has lost his hand, Frodo has lost his finger. What they've been doing is the impossible quest, the central and iconic quest of the age, the rescue of the Silmarils, the destruction of the ring in the Third Age. In both cases, there is a degree of personal defeat. Frodo has not been able to throw the ring into the fire. Beren, in fact, has not been able to rescue the Silmaril because his hand has been eaten up by this werewolf, and so which has gone away. So in a way, it's been, to a certain extent, a defeat, or at least a personal defeat. Even more importantly, in both stories, the heroes are rescued in the very moment of despair. Just when the quest of the Silmaril was like to have ended in ruin and despair, just at the very moment, the eagles arrived. And the same in The Lord of the Rings, when he says, yes, and even as he espied, so that's the eagle, them and came swooping down, he saw them fall, worn out, or choked with fumes and heat, or stricken down by despair at last, hiding their eyes from death. So it's quite clear that the situation is similar. Also, the setting is similar. In both cases, there is a sort of volcano-like eruption going on. It's quite clear that what Sam has just said before the eagles arrived is very correct. They are in the same tale, and in a way, they have relived the same tale of Beren and Luthien in different forms. And the fact that this parallelism was important for Tolkien is also confirmed by a key detail in the textual history of the text. That is to say that in the early version of Beren and Luthien, before The Lord of the Rings, the three eagles do not appear. In one version, Tolkien doesn't say how they're rescued. In another version, it's the big dog that rescues them. But when the Hobbit has been written, when The Lord of the Rings has been written, then Tolkien revises the version of the Silmarillion and puts the three eagles there. And later, I think in the late 50s, he will even change the name of the eagle of The Lord of the Rings to make sure that it's the same eagle that rescued Beren and Luthien. So, in fact, the eagle, one of the three eagles, is exactly the same, with the difference that in the Silmarillion, the Quair was just one of the attendants, whereas in The Lord of the Rings, has become, if you want, the leader of the group. So there is a continuity there, which is physical to an extreme level. It's the same eagle who rescued the two characters. This kind of parallelism, narrative parallelism between different stories, the one between Beren and Frodo, is just one example of many, many, many parallels, many intratextual parallels, we may say, in the world of the Legendarium, which somehow connects all the different tales into this complex and interconnected web of narrative units. All different to a certain extent. Of course, Frodo and Sam are quite different from Beren and Luthien, and yet all alike, like links of the same chain, or we may start introducing another important image as leaves within the same tree. And of course, I'm thinking of Leaf by an Eagle here. Just to, again, I don't want to delve too much into this, but just to broaden up a bit the web of connection, we can point out how clearly Frodo and Bilbo are very connected. In many ways, the adventure of Frodo in The Lord of the Rings is a sort of another version of the story of The Hobbit. And again, Tolkien makes to make it very clear. The adventure starts with the same song, or better, with the song sung in the same music. The music of the dwarves is reused by Merry before they leave. And in fact, Merry began a song which they had apparently got ready for the occasion. It was made on the model of the dwarf song that started Bilbo on his adventure long ago and went to the same tune. The adventure begins with the same kind of music. They actually, especially in the first part, they go to the same places, as you remember. There are again many meta-literary moments, for instance, where Merry and the others remember having read The Hobbit, so having heard the story of The Hobbit, and will encounter, for instance, the trolls, or will see the same places that Bilbo visited. They also meet quite similar characters, if you think. I mean, both of them fight spiders at a certain point, and in fact, we know that the spiders are connected, because the spiders of Mirkwood are, in fact, the offspring of Shelob. So in many ways, the same story is quite the same. And there is one scene in particular, which again, of course, is quite analogous, and we have already seen it, which is in fact, the very scene of the arrival of the eagles. And again, that's something that the characters within the Lord of the Rings acknowledge very explicitly. This is Pippin speaking at the end of the battle in front of the gate of Mordor. The eagles are coming. The eagles are coming. For one moment more, Pippi's thought hovered. Bilbo, he said, but no, they came in his tale long, long ago. This is my tale, and it is ending now. Goodbye. And his thought fled far away, and his eyes saw no more. It's a bit of a paradox here, because although Pippin is denying that the scene is the same, in fact, it is the same scene, to the point that there are many parallels between the behavior of Bilbo and Pippin, because Bilbo in The Hobbit, if you remember, sees the eagles and then faints because he's hit by a stone. In the same way, Pippin sees the eagles and then faints. Again, it's the story which is repeated. And most specifically, even the way the Battle of the Five Armies and the way the eagles intervene, of course, in a different way in the Lord of the Rings, is quite clearly the same. And again, we can point out some intertextual connections there. Again, let me stress, it's alike but unlike. The story of Bilbo is not exactly the same as the story of Frodo, of course, but it is like the story. This sort of pattern of likeness and unlikeness is very important for Tolkien and can also be found in many other important narrative parallels, including the one between Beren and Aragorn, and of course Lúthien and Arwen. So you see I expanded on one side the character of Frodo with Bilbo, and then I expand now the character of Beren to Aragorn. And again, this is all very explicit. When Aragorn meets for the first time Arwen, as Tolkien recalls in the appendix, Aragorn had been singing a part of the Lay of Lúthien, which tells of the meeting of Lúthien and Beren in the forest of Neldoreth. He called to her, crying, "Tinuviel, Tinuviel," even as Beren had done in the elder days long ago. That's in a way, it's very similar to what Sam does on the Mounts of Mondum. He has a story in mind, and he suddenly interprets what's going on with the same sort of lens. Again, you see the meta-literary, almost a meta-literary mise en abîme. So the whole story is sort of embedded in the present in a new form. And this connection between the stories of Beren and Aragorn and Lúthien and Arwen in Tolkien has also a genealogical dimension. We know, in fact, that Arwen and Aragorn, two different branches, are in fact the descendants of Beren and Lúthien. So the similarity between their tales, again, also takes on a physical dimension, as Tolkien says, describing Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, in whom it was said that the likeness of Lúthien had come on earth again. The same old character is now coming on earth again. And we see how this double feature is so important, like and unlike, as Tolkien stresses in the letter to Hastings, in Peter Hastings, which he discusses the problem of reincarnation. Arwen is not a reincarnation of Lúthien, but rather a descendant, very like her in looks, character, and fate. You see looks and character, but also fate. These two stories are very similar, and yet they are different. It's not just a repetition, it's not a reincarnation, it's something a bit different. This genealogical image, the idea that the stories of the past are renewed in new form in the present, is omnipresent, is in the Lord of the Rings. We find it especially in connection with the idea of renewal. If you think how many things are renewed in the Lord of the Rings, the blade that was broken will be renewed. Elessar Aragorn himself is the renewer and Viniator, the one who brings back the kingdom of Gondor, and the tree himself that was with her shall be renewed. The tree, the blade, Aragorn, everything is renewed. And I think that especially this beautiful scene when Aragorn finds the sapling of the tree on the Mount of Mindulin is very iconic, if you want, in kind of clarifying what is this genealogical model for Tolkien. As Gandalf says to Aragorn, this is the sapling of the line of Nimnor the Fair, and there was a seedling of Galathilion, and the foot of Telperion of many names, eldest of three. If ever a fruit ripens, it should be planted, lest the line died out of the world. It's a line, it's a genealogical line. It is as if, again, you see a new fruit, a new sapling is born in unexpected places, which is alike yet unlike the old one. But it is all, in a way, very connected. Another image somehow which develops this idea of connection while preserving the difference, of unity in diversity, if you want, is of course the image of the road, as we read in the very first chapters of The Lord of the Rings. Bilbo used often to say that there was only one road. It was like a great river, its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. Just if you use the concept of story and connect it with the idea of path, and they connect it with the idea of spring, you can see how every single individual path, every single individual story is somehow connected to a bigger road, is connected to a bigger river. And we see this connection in a powerful way with the use of the very famous 2 poems by Bilbo, one that comes at the beginning and one that comes at the very end. And it's quite important because they somehow frame the whole story by underlying that with this idea, the road goes ever on and on. The genealogical line of that we were referring to before, it's never ending. It can never be finished, at least in this world. So just to sum up a bit this first part of the talk, we can see how this idea of a narrative parallelism, this narrative parallelism that we identified in the stories of Beren and Frodo, but also Beren and Aragorn and Frodo and Bilbo, and we can go forever and ever, is connected with this idea of a single story. For Tolkien, there is, in fact, a single story, a single narrative road, which goes over on and on, that is to say, that continues and is renewed, always in different and yet always similar individual particular stories, alike and unlike. A very important point, the spring of the road, so if you want, the beginning of the story is at every doorstep, as Bilbo's poem says, that is to say, the starting point in this vision of a unique single story is always the doorstep. It's not the story, the river. We always start from the doorstep, from the beginning, from the individual, from the particular. This connection, so the idea that, as we saw before in the case of Sam, the connection, the fact that Sam realizes to be in the same story of Beren, comes eventually, at the end of the narrative event. It comes as a revelation. It's a sudden revelation. It's a discovery, if you want. It's not a fulfillment of an intellectual intention. Frodo and Sam are not starting their adventures with the idea that they're going to renew the story of Beren and Lúthien. They are going to discover it only at the very end. And that's something which is, for Tolkien, is valid not just for secondary literary characters, but also for human beings. I quote from letter 183, "Men do go and have in history gone on journeys and quests without any intention of acting out allegories of life." And in fact, as I try to express in Bilbo Walking Son, even in afternoon to evening walk may have important effects. That is to say, every single journey or quest that we do has an important effect, has a significance, but the significance is not the reason why we started the journey in the first place. How can we describe all this connection, these parallels between the different characters, Beren and Frodo and so on? Are these internal allegories, to come at last to the question they started with? Is Frodo an allegory of Beren? Certainly not. Frodo is not an allegory of Beren, and yet, to a certain extent, Frodo could be construed as an allegory of Beren by those so minded. That is to say, for Tolkien, it is to a certain extent true that particular stories are related to each other. They allegorically, if you want, they refer to something else, but always they have their independent idiosyncratic features. So for Tolkien, the individual idiosyncratic features are ennobled, if you want, are given value. They're not obliterated as, if you want, in a more classical tradition where everything is allegorical. At the end of the day, everything is an excuse, if you think about Aristotle, to talk about something else. But at the end of the day, what matters is what is underlined. Instead, even from a narrative point of view and a literal point of view, the main concern for Tolkien is to integrate the low and the high. The low and the high are integrated, but they are kept. The low remains low to a certain extent. The hobbits remain hobbits, yet they encounter the elves. So that's the first part. So we are still now in the secondary world, but to go back to the question I started with, we need to move on a bit to the primary world and address more specifically the question of allegory. What does all this to do with allegory? And to to do that, really, we need to say to crisscross, to move out of the secondary and go to the primary, while, as I'm going to do, stay quite close to the tale of Beren and Luthien. Because, of course, the tale of Beren and Luthien was a tale that had a very important primary significance for Tolkien, as everyone who has not been to a Warwick cemetery in North Oxford would have seen the grave. In the gravestone, Edith Mary Tolkien is Luthien and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien is Beren. As Tolkien says in the letter he wrote when the gravestone was made, a brief inscription, except for Luthien, which says for me then a multitude of words. She was and knew she was my Luthien. I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. You see here how the kind of genealogical connection, the sort of connect, in this sense, is now going into the primary world. Beren is Tolkien, Tolkien is Beren, Luthien is Edith is Luthien. What does this mean? Shall we take then Beren and Luthien and their tales to be allegories for Tolkien and Edith and their love stories? Can we make this sort of connection there? Again, yes and no, alike and unlike. What kind of theoretical framework Tolkien would use to explain this sort of relationship? Certainly not an allegorical one, but another one which to a certain extent is quite similar to the one we already discussed before. That is to say, a genealogical framework. There are a couple of quotations that I put there which such hints to what kind of idea Tolkien had about the way Luthien was related to Edith. That is to say, in the quote, the first two, there lives still those of whom Luthien was the foremother. It is said that their line shall never fail. The line of Luthien shall never fail, though the years may be lengthened beyond count. And again, Luthien is the forerunner of many whom the elders see yet, though the world is changed, the likeness of Luthien, the beloved. So in Tolkien's imagination, it is as if Luthien, the line of Luthien, just like the line of Luthien and Beren and all the other characters, will never fail. It is to say, we may say that Luthien's line will continue to sprout, though the years may lengthen beyond count, throughout the world is changed. I do think that this implies the idea that this story will be always renewed, also in the primary world. Of course, this genealogical connection is not biologically real, but it is real in a different sense. It is true in a different sense. Tolkien and Luthien and Edith, in fact, were genealogically connected with Beren and Luthien in a way which is more to do with literature. It's quite clear also from other passages that I discuss in the book how Tolkien went so far to extend his own genealogical organic image and a related archetypical idea of renewal across the line that divides the secondary and the primary world, the fiction and the reality. And we have come at last to the question of allegory. Okay, so after this long introduction, the first and the secondary world, then the primary world, I promise they will be short. We can see how all these images of renewal, of genealogical embodiment come together to explain why Tolkien was, on the one hand, so averse to allegory, but on the other hand, somehow allowed it to a certain extent. And there will be, if you want, the most theoretical part of the paper and the final one, but to follow it, I think it was very important first to enter into the fabric of the secondary world. Tolkien never wrote a treatise on allegory, of course, as we know it, and I'm very well aware that anyone who tries to kind of be systematic has to address a danger in a way, because Tolkien is not a systematic thinker. But I do think that in a way one can at least try to put some order in the thoughts of Tolkien and try to find a somehow cohesive, coherent vision of why allegory was problematic, and yet somehow he has a role in this world. So there will be 5 points, basically. First point, again, go step by step, but hopefully will be clear enough. So the first point, for Tolkien, the stories come first. A very important opposition that we have in Tolkien is the one between story and allegory. Story and allegory are distinct. They are two different things. Tolkien is someone who makes story. Naturally in him, the stories come first. The mere stories were the thing. They arose in my mind as given things, And as they came separately, so too the links grew. You see how this is related to the idea of the road and the path, the river and the tributary. They start separately and then the links grew. They start coming together. Second point for Tolkien, therefore, because for him the stories come first, the starting point and focus of his sub-creative activity is the particular, the idiosyncratic, the detail. Is the doorstep, is the path, is the spring, not the river of the road. It is the atmosphere, the inclassifiable individual details of a story that really count. To my mind, it is the particular use in a particular situation of any motive that is the most interesting thing to consider. Not the motive, but the use in a particular situation in a particular way. Third point, because of that, the art, the ambition, the creative ambition of sub-creator is purely aesthetic. It's polytechnical, if you want. That is to say, to succeed in creating a good, a beautiful, a successful story. First of all, a story must succeed just as a tale, excite, please, and even on occasion move, and within its own imagined world to be accorded literary belief. To succeed in that was my primary object. I was primarily, and I think this is important, I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background such I find personally attractive. This primary, the primaria, someone used to say, the starting point is always this, the attraction, is the atmosphere, is the exciting story. And yet, in this process of aesthetic, artistic creation, truth plays a role. Already in the quote I put there, you see, fairy story has its own mode of reflecting truth. To write an exciting story, to succeed in the sub-creative artistic endeavor is, just like in the case, for instance, of Michelangelo, put here a famous statue of Michelangelo's, to find and reveal the truth within an artistic object. The story must have literary truth on the secondary plane. The task of the sub-creator is not, and as we says many, many times, an act of invention. To succeed does not mean to be a successful inventor, it's not to be a good trickster. To succeed, to be exciting from a creative point of view, means to be able to reveal the literary truth out of the matter of language, if you want, just like Michelangelo was extracting, revealing the truth of the statues from the block of stone. And that explains this act of revelation, why for Tolkien, even the most meaningful events of the Lord of the Rings are always inevitable. You know, these few quotes I put here, he really connects some of the most important events, especially the final event, the Gollum fight with Sam on Mount Doom, and that which is of course very meaningful in many different ways. For Tolkien, as he says, from the point of view of the storyteller, the events of Mount Doom proceed simply for the logic of the tale up to the time. And again, I did not arrange the deliverance in this case. It again follows the logic of the story. Following the logic of the plot, it was clearly inevitable as an event. So you see how when the art of the sub-creator, the art of the writers, is almost scientific to a certain extent, because it's kind of it aims to reveal what is logical, what is needed, what is inevitable. And it's only then that the meaning is revealed. Well, there's a very good example of that for Tolkien is the ring. The meaning of the ring, with its allegorical significance, arose as an inevitable consequence of the fact that he had been taken seriously from the start. I reread now the quote from which I started. You can see how Tolkien acknowledges the allegorical significance of the ring, but only because he has been taken serious in the first place. It is to say, only because sub-creators revealed the literary truth of the ring, then it became allegorical. You can make the ring into an allegory of our own time if you like, but this is only because all power, magical, mechanical does always so work. You cannot write a story about an apparently simple magic ring without that bursting in. You see, the allegorical meaning burst in if you really take the thing seriously and make things happen the way they will happen if such a thing existed. So the more the sub-creator, the more the writer is attentive and clear to the literary truth, the more, if you want, the primary truth burst into the story. So you see here the kind of the great paradox for Tolkien. The life and truth, even the allegorical significance of a particular story, the life and truth of a particular story, not allegorical, but kind of purely literary, purely artistic and technical, is always proportional to the extent they embody the universals. The idiosyncratic, the individual, the particular, the single story, the more the single story is effective, the more it becomes allegorical, and vice versa. The actors are individuals. The short stories, parts, springs, tributaries, they each, of course, contain universals, or they will not live at all. But they never represent them as such. They have allegorical significance, but they have it because they don't represent it as such. And again, I suppose that if one makes a good choice in what is a good narrative or at the given point, you see the technical, the artistic craft of the artistic endeavor, it will also be found to be the case that the event described will be the most significant. Again, the allegorical, the significance, burst in a good narrative, which has been followed good choices. So we see here at this point how story and allegory can converge. And we can read now a quotation which is very famous, but I think now we should make a bit more sense. Allegory and story converge, meeting somewhere in truth. So that the only perfectly consistent allegory is a real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. And when one finds, even in imperfect human literature, like The Lord of the Rings, that the better and more consistent an allegory is, the more easily can be read as a story. And the better and more closely woven a story is, like The Lord of the Rings, the more easily can docile-minded, not everyone can docile-minded find allegory in it. But the two start out from opposite ends. So we can see here how the recognition of the universal truth embodied in a particular story does not come as the expected fulfillment of the intellectual project. It's not at the beginning Tolkien has the clear what he wants to say, essentially. But rather it comes as a sudden revelation, as an unexpected event, as a mystery. As he says in reference to a comment of W.H. Auden, I believe that it is precisely because I did not try and have never thought of trying to objectify, you may say to represent, to allegorize my personal experience of life, the account of the Quest of the Ring is successful in giving pleasure to Auden, and we even had to find all the significance that Auden found when he read it. So, moving to the conclusion, for Tolkien, history, or rather, we can take the HI away, but it's the same. History and story are the same for Tolkien. There's not a real difference. History and story, because they are real, whereas allegory is something a bit different. History, story, and allegory are distinct, but potentially converge. They can converge because, as he says in another letter, it is impossible to write any story that is not allegorical in proportion as it comes to life. Since each of us is an allegory embodying a particular tale, and clothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth, and everlasting life. It is impossible to write a successful story that comes to life that has not allegorical significance. We can therefore say that for Tolkien, it is appropriate to start always from the details. The starting point, even in real life, is always the detail. That's why he could write in a beautiful letter to his son in 1944, do not think that any detail of your exterior life, your friends, acquaintances, or the most minor events are not worth writing or of interest. And of course, as you already discovered, one of the discoveries of the process of looking after and thinking about the detail is the realization of the values that often lurk under dreadful appearances. We get to the value, to the meaning, only by going to the depth of the particular. And this is valid in real life as in secondary life. This problem, again, I'm not going to delve much into this because it will open another big topic, which I don't have the time to discuss. This idea of being able, in a way, to for the literary writer to do something idiosyncratic, distinct, particular, is a big challenge. As Tolkien will refer very often, it is very different. It's very, very difficult for a literary writer to maintain a difference of quality in atmosphere in events that might easily become samey. This to say, I'm paraphrasing a bit, since at the end of the day, all stories are somehow connected. All stories are somehow embodied these universal values, if you want. The most difficult task, in fact, and is really to be individual, to maintain the difference of quality. I was talking just a couple of weeks to this writer who gave here in Oxford to give the fantasy lecture this year, and she exactly said that. I mean, the most difficult task of a writer is to make something different from everything else, because everything else has already been said, as the ancient knew very, very, very well. This whole problem of likeness and unlikeness, which is related to the whole problem of subcreation as a sort of a tree of tales, as a sort of a road make the very different parts, is related to a big discussion that was going on in the 30s and 40s about the motives and modes or archetypes and so on, which I will not be able to discuss today, but I refer to my book for further discussion. But it's quite clear, I will only say, that Tolkien did not like to match the idea of the archetype, did not like to match the idea of a motive, because they did not enough value to the individual. But at the same time, he knew very, very well the individual in the particular is connected with the archetypical. So at the end of the day, that's why he always puts these two words, motives and mods, in inverted commas, or most of the times. This idea that artistic creations embody universal truths, and the more they are powerful, the more artistic creations are successful, the more they embody universal truth, is of course very old. So in a way, in a meta-literary sense, we can even say that Tolkien is not very original in that, because that's something that already Aristotle and Plato believed in different ways. And in the early 19th century, there were people like T.S. Eliot who wrote very important essays on this. So to a certain extent, there is nothing original. And yet, just as in the case of the story of Frodo and Beren and all the others, there are certain elements of Tolkien's vision that seem to me unique to him, and I think they're deeply linked to his commitment to creation and ultimately to his Christian experience, I will say. But since it's already quite late, I will refer to my book for further discussion, and thank you for your patience tonight.